I don't like sort of sitting up here and talking way to you down there, and I'm certainly not going to read this paper, but I'd like to have it available to me. So if you don't mind, I will probably sit up here, although who knows, I'll probably start wandering around after a while. But maybe I can just start out by giving a bit of an idea of what I mean by meaning and the moral imperative, and how I kind of got to that idea. The subtitle is probably a more illuminating description of what I'm going to try to get at. The subtitle is called "In Search of a Truth Narrative," and this paper basically is deals with the whole issue of the transition from modernism to postmodernism, or from modernity to kind of the postmodern world. And it's an attempt to come to terms with the issue that a lot of people of postmodern persuasion insist that there's no longer any room for kind of larger totalistic statements about meaning or about the nature of humanity or the nature of the world. And I'm going to take issue with that in ways that I think are true to some of the claims that postmodern people, or people of postmodern persuasion, postmodernists, claim is the nature of the world we live in today. I'd like to give a couple of sources of what led me to write this paper and struggle with these ideas. And one of them began a couple of years ago. I was asked to write a short controversial statement for a local newsletter in the area of family therapy. And so I entitled it "Narratives and Meta-Narratives." And I argued in that little short presentation that this kind of postmodern claim that the postmodern people insist that it's kind of as a definition and a slogan of postmodernism. There's a French postmodernist named Jean-Francois Lyotard, who wrote a book about 20 years ago called "The Postmodern Condition." And very early on, he defined postmodernism as an incredulity toward meta-narratives. Now, what does he mean by that? What is a meta-narrative in the first place? Well, meta-narrative has been defined by somebody, but I forget who, as a story that explains all other stories. And he argued in The Postmodern Condition, it became a kind of almost sacred scripture of postmodernism, if you can imagine such a statement, that what characterizes the postmodern world is that all of the old binding narratives or binding beliefs that held the society and the culture together had lost their credibility. That probably beginning with the decline of the hold that religion held, and the Christian story or the biblical story held over Western society, which really started, still had a pretty tight hold in the 19th century, but it was waning, and into the 20th century has been a kind of a decline of the hold that the Christian meta-narrative has held over Western society. But that probably since World War II, and at a kind of a exponential pace, the modern belief in the inevitability of progress came rapidly under fire as we began to realize that the world wasn't necessarily getting better all the time, and it wasn't necessarily getting better because of the light that science was bringing. So the story that explains all other stories of Christianity, the biblical story, had come under fire and lost much of its credibility. And the story of that made sense of all other stories of the inevitability of progress was becoming riddled with holes, and the whole notion of science as having the answer to all of our problems and would lead us to the golden age had been pretty much discredited by the discovery of and use of nuclear weapons, which demonstrated that science could be just as much of an agent of destruction as it could be of our salvation. So the postmodern claim then was that the nature of the world we live in today is such that there's no possibility of a larger beliefs about the nature of, as I said before, the universe, or the nature of human beings or of human societies. And so that we've just got to do the best we can with our own personal stories and the kind of local narratives that kind of emerge in the communities we live in as we talk back and forth with each other. So I began to reflect on that, and the more I thought that the one great story of modernity, of the modern world, has been the story of emancipation, primarily the emancipation of the individual, and it goes back a long, long way. It goes right back to probably the end of the Middle Ages, when the church had been in increasing conflict with the secular authorities, and were continually exerting that authority in increasingly coercive ways. But the more coercive the church became, and the more it became involved in the world of power, the more it actually kind of gave strength to the forces that were increasingly arrayed against it in the form of the secular societies of, first of all, Italy, the great city-states of Italy and eventually France and into Germany. And what this gave rise to was a gradual process of secularization. That there could be, and there was a division, a division between the world of the sacred and the world of the secular. Now, once that process began, it appears to have become unstoppable. And it seems to me that that's one of the great kind of puzzles of the whole thing that modernity, which is fundamentally a uniquely Western happening, once it kind of made the point through the establishment of the secular state that there could be a realm apart from the sacred, then a force all of its own got going. And what that involved, however, was that once you had a secular area that looked at the world in a disenchanted way, then it became possible to criticize pretty much everything. Now, the criticism began fairly cautiously. It began by disregarding the church's proscriptions against looking too closely at the natural world. So it started out looking at the heavens and looking critically at the heavens and taking issue with the church's position that came out of Aristotle, basically, or the kind of baptism of Aristotle, that the heavens were a stable realm. That fit into the kind of whole theological sense of the world as stable and eternal and linear. So modernity began by examining the heavens. Then it came a little closer and examined the earth. Then it came a little closer and examined, started looking at other life. Then it came a little closer and started looking at human beings. And so what was kind of let loose on the world was a whole process of critical analysis. And so modernity became synonymous with the critical examination of the world. And the critical examination of the world with an effort to changing the world, and an effort to changing the world for the better. Now, another kind of piece of how I got going with this idea of writing this paper was that I communicate with a lot of people of postmodern persuasion, and their position seems very much to be that postmodern is good, and as opposed to the bad old days of modernism, or the bad old ideas of the modernists, who supposedly stood for a very rigid, objectivistic notion of the nature of things, and that there were certain universal ideas that you could validate, and that objective science could lead the way toward a better and better world. But it seemed to me that actually I found myself reacting quite viscerally to these kind of immediate criticisms of modernism, these kind of what I thought weren't very well thought out criticisms of modernism, and I found myself thinking, gee, you know, modernism was a pretty great thing and a pretty exciting time in the history of the world. I mean, I guess it was very much a Western idea, no society in history before the emergence of modernity in the Western world had ever proceeded with the idea that it was open season on everything, that every phenomenon, whether it was the heavens or whether it was the way the earth, the natural world, whether it was human nature, whether it was even the soul of humanity, was free from criticism. So, but not simply criticism in order to break down and to destroy, but to free and to liberate. That modernism was about freeing human beings from every religious, social, and cultural constraint against their free expression. That meant we were free to explore, we were free to exercise our curiosity, we were free to exercise our abilities, that no one could tell us what to think. There wasn't a superior hierarchy of people, some of whom had an inherent claim to betterness than anyone else. Everything was up for grabs, and once the individual was freed in that way, then those forces that stood in the way could be changed in the direction of making the world a better place for its people. Now, I think what's happened with the transition from the modern to the so-called postmodern has been that this force called modernity has turned on itself, has turned reflexively on itself, in the sense that modernism was about submitting everything to critical examination, and what postmodernism is simply modernity criticizing itself, criticizing its own assumptions, so that the whole notion, the whole driving force of modernity was changing the world, criticizing anything that stood in the way of changing the world. And so what developed along with that were, as I said, the meta-narratives of progress, and through scientific objectivization of the world and objectivization of the self, even. But once modernism then began, or modernity began to turn on itself and examine even its own assumptions, even its own story about all other stories, the stories that explain the other stories, then the notion of progress kind of fell through. The notion of scientific objectivity fell through, and we found ourselves in a world where there's it seemed there's nothing to believe. And instead of critical analysis as the tool of postmodernism became deconstruction. And deconstruction was a kind of a part of this process of reflexivization. And the form this kind of reflexivization, this turning in on everything and taking it apart, takes in everyday life, is that whereas in modernism the world was criticized and analyzed and interpreted, everything was interpreted, and so Marx interpreted civilized social life as class warfare, nothing but class warfare in a sense. Freud interpreted rational man as driven by irrational needs. Darwin interpreted the beauty and awesomeness of nature as a struggle for survival. Nietzsche interpreted morality as a quest for power, so that everything was interpreted as something other than as it appeared. In the postmodern world, we're left with simply what appears, but we still kind of interpret everything, but the interpretation is kind of empty. So that one of my favorite writers on all this stuff is a kind of a maverick Slovenian post-Marxist named Slavoj Žižek, and he gives a kind of a darkly humorous example of the neo-Nazi skinhead who, when pressed for the reasons for his extreme violence, suddenly starts to talk like a social worker, and quoting diminished social responsibility or social mobility, rising insecurity, loss of paternal authority, and so what we've kind of developed in the postmodern world is the ability to interpret our every action, but it doesn't make any difference. In the days of modernism, when you interpreted, say in Freudian terms, if you interpreted your dreams as to what they really meant, it had a kind of a shock effect, and it kind of shocked you into thinking more about yourself and acting differently. In the postmodern world, we interpret everything, says Žižek, but it serves more to excuse our actions than to change them or to shock them. The other aspect of the postmodern that is an extension and a turning in of modernity is the whole notion of the transgressive. Like what modernity was all about, and it really came to the fore in the rise of modernism in the arts and so forth, was liberation through transgression. All the old rules had to be examined and challenged, and if need be broken. Anything that stood in the way of our emancipation from previous irrational constraints we were justified in breaking through it, transgressing those limits, so that the transgressive was used as an instrument to shock us into looking at the world in a new way. And But in the inward turning of postmodernism, what has happened is that the transgressive has become normative. It's as if, again, it has a life that modernity has a life of its own. It only knows one direction, and that is forward, and the continuation of its own means. And so the transgressive becomes that we have to keep on transgressing, so that any conventional norm, whether it has to do with taste or sexual behavior or various cultural traditions, need to be challenged and broken through. It's as if the need to shock has to find something more shocking each time to keep this process of transgression going forward. Along with that then comes a continual loosening of the whole kind of normative structure of the society. The collapse of the old meta-narratives, the stories that explained everything, and the collapse and the loss in credibility of the kind of religious and cultural norms that came increasingly under attack, has left us kind of in a world where choice is endlessly possible and endlessly made available, but the problem with choice is it makes living quite difficult. The nice thing about having various norms, norms for behavior, norms for regulating our relationships, norms for regulating our sexual behavior, norms for regulating just common courtesies, is that you don't have to think every time an ambiguous social situation comes along, or every time an uncertain social situation comes along, or a new one. You know how to act. You've been taught how to act. The norms are there, the standards are there, the values are there, and they don't have to be thought through at every time. But what modernity has created in the so-called postmodern world is a world where unlimited choice is present and demanded. It's demanded because there's no longer an overriding cultural consensus on how to behave, and so when it comes to, say, for instance, raising children, parents don't know how to behave, how to raise their children. They have to think about it all the time. They have to read books, they have to consult experts. They don't just do it. Ilka and I had a conversation with my mother, I think a couple of years ago, and we were talking about raising children, being a parent. And she made the interesting comment that when we were parents, we never even thought about being parents. We never thought about what you do or how you do it. We just did it. Well, in some ways, I could only think of that. I could only answer that, yes, I know. But it's so different from what happens today, where we have to think about it all the time. We have to make choices. We're almost condemned to a life of choice. So that life in the postmodern world becomes exhilarating, but at the very least, highly challenging. So what do we do in the face of all of this? Is there any way out of it? One of the other factors I think that's really contributed to, it's interesting that where the ideas of postmodernism came from. They're basically Anglo-American concepts. In most of the great gurus of postmodernism are French intellectuals, but I'm told that with the possible exception of Lyotard and Jean Baudrillard, French intellectuals don't call themselves postmodernists. They don't use the term postmodern. They don't call themselves post-structuralists. If anything, they just simply call themselves moderns or modernists. They don't make this great distinction that we've made in Britain and in North America. But nonetheless, the ideas of a kind of a pulling in, a retrenchment, a pulling back, a giving up, a loss of nerve that in many ways are part of the postmodern scene, came about as a result, I think, of two fundamental factors. One was the great sort of disillusionment that came as the great promises, the great utopian hopes of the 60s gave way. In Europe, particularly the events of May 1968, which I guess were the real high point of the 60s politically in Europe, those hopes collapsed. It was also around that time that the Prague Spring broke out in Czechoslovakia, and there was this great hope that both East and West were united in bringing about a better world. And there were even those who entertained such hopes with regard to the Cultural Revolution in China, also happening around this time, which of course was later realized to have been something of a nightmare all of its own. But those great utopian hopes of the 60s all waned into the 70s, and the disillusionment with Marxism, which had been kind of an ideological meta-narrative for many intellectuals in Europe and even in North America to some extent. Marxism began more and more to seem like it had very little to offer after all, and that and I think this is where a lot of the postmodern ideas about the bad things to do with any kind of ambitious plan to change the world came crashing down. And it was that ambitious plans to change the world create totalitarian nightmares. There's the expression, I think, by the Spanish painter Goya, the dreams of reason produce monsters. And all of the kind of utopian ideals of modernity in many ways came to a head in Marxism, and it produced a totalitarian terror state. When the communist empire imploded in the late 80s, early 90s. That was kind of the finishing touch, and I think at that point, the postmodern became a time of disillusionment, of modest hopes for a moderately, but not greatly, better world. Now, if modernism and modernity were about the liberation of the individual, of the self, you might say, postmodern thought has really focused greatly on the importance of the other, the marginalized other. And this is a product of the whole idea of deconstruction, which was a term invented by Jacques Derrida. And unfortunately, Derrida either writes with great obscurity on purpose or because he can't write any other way, I'm not sure. But the fundamental idea of deconstruction is fairly simple, and it is that there's a fault line running through all of Western thought, and you might even argue human thought, that tends to privilege one side on that fault line and to marginalize the other side. And so what we have is a kind of a half-hearted Marxism that, or post-Marxism, that says that everything that had to do with everything associated with what has made Western society as dominant as it has become has been privileged for 2,500 years. Everything to do with things white, male, European, heterosexual has been privileged, and everything not white, male, heterosexual has been marginalized, whether it be women, people of color, non-Europeans, people of other sexual preferences. All these have been marginalized. So it led postmodern thinkers then to idealize the other and to be suspicious of everything that had to do with the previous claims about everything that we had thought was so wonderful about the modern world, and so advanced and so progressive. And so it then happened that there's a great Jewish philosopher named Emmanuel Levinas, who for many decades, not in any way associated with postmodern thinking, but Levinas developed the idea of the philosophy of the other. He pointed out, kind of in parallel, in tandem with the ideas that Derrida was talking about, that Western thought has been preoccupied with the notion of the same. And so we're always, Western thought is always operated in terms of the quest for unity, for a quest for underlying similarities. And he sees that as having originated in ancient Greece and been characteristic of Western thought ever since. He says there's a whole other stream in Western thought, and it's the thought that's come out of Israel, and the theme that Israel and Jewishness has always represented has been the primacy, the priority of the other. That we are defined in terms of the other person. In other words, selfhood is even defined in terms of we come up against the other, and we have to adapt ourselves, accommodate ourselves, define ourselves. So we're actually defining ourselves in terms of the other. And of course, the ultimate other, the holy other, is God. Now, recently, a French philosopher, has taken considerable issue with this. He speaks with a postmodern sensibility, but is very anti the postmodern position. And he suggests something that's really quite arresting. He challenges Levinas, and Levinas is just being regarded as almost a saintly, sacrosanct figure. But he says, no, we've got it all wrong once again. That, yes, we embrace the other, but we don't embrace difference for its own sake. We don't embrace the otherness of the other. What we embrace in the other and what we seek in the other is our common humanity. And so he argues that it's the sameness in the other that we cherish. And so when we see people of different traditions, of different races, of different practices, yes, we invite and welcome. But it's not the otherness of the other. It's not the differentness of the other. It's that we recognize in all that strangeness, we recognize our common humanity. And so Badiou calls us to a new universality, and he argues against the postmodern stream that there is still room for an ethic of universality, that any morality or any ethical position that isn't universal is not truly an ethical position. It's a step backwards. It's a step back into tribalism, essentially, as we're eventually finds out, is that the people that we like are good, and we're not so sure about the rest, except that it's somehow in a weird kind of reversal in the postmodern scene, where it's almost become that the people we like are the people that are other than ourselves, and the people we don't like are the people that are the same as ourselves. And I think that's created that kind of thinking has really created a lot of peculiarities in the so-called postmodern world. The other theme that Badiou comes up with, which I think is quite wonderful, he says, yes, indeed, there is no more room for an objective sense of truth and an objective sense of morality. So what? What we do is look out upon the world and allow ourselves to be addressed by a particular problem, a particular challenge, a particular concern, a particular other person, and we commit ourselves to that truth. We commit ourselves to that story. He doesn't call it a story, he calls it an event. I prefer the idea of a truth narrative. He says, where we go from here is that we embrace a universal ethic, and it's a truth ethic in that it's the truth that I embrace, or the truth that we embrace if we act as a community, that we commit ourselves to to this story, and we remain utterly faithful to this story or to this person, and that becomes the truth by which we live our lives. Now, alongside Badiou's ideas of the truth event, someone else that I'm finding speaks very well to this particular time is the Protestant theologian Stanley Hauerwas. Now, he identifies himself with a postmodern position, and he operates from within a Christian ethic. That puts character at the very heart of the ethic, and he says that what we do is we think of our lives, certainly in terms of a narrative, of a story, but what a story does is give our lives character. It gives our lives a way of being true to ourselves. And how he puts it, being the Christian theologian that he is, that it's necessary to become a character who is true to your own story, but it's a story within a community of of people who share that story, so that it's the direction narrative goes in a postmodern world, or needs to go in a postmodern world, is toward a sense of shared stories, not toward a sense of my personal story, but it's a story that is shared by others and calls us to be and to act consistently with that story. Now, the other theme I think that's quite hopeful in postmodern times, increasingly, is the idea of the performative. It's the idea that that things aren't measured by what we think. Things aren't measured by our ideas. They're measured by the extent to which the idea and the action are one and the same. And this is why Badiou's idea of the truth event and Hauerwas's idea of one's narrative making oneself into a character who expresses one's integrity in the community in which one of those who share the story that person's a part of, makes narrative into a performative activity. And a performative statement, for instance, is a statement the very stating of which enacts what it states. I promise. When a person says "I promise," that means it's as good as done. It's supposed to be what it means. I now pronounce you man and wife. This meeting is hereby open. This meeting is hereby closed. These are performative statements, and what the direction of the hopeful direction of how we provide stability for ourselves in a postmodern world is the notion of embracing a truth according to a shared story that calls us to act in immediate faithfulness to the story that our life is identified with. And I see that we're starting to run a little short on time, so I'd be quite happy to entertain questions or comments or discussion in the minutes remaining.
Just wondering what your thoughts are about Rene Girard. And if I understand him correctly, he's saying that our myths are what gives us a common story in the myth. We can't just make up a new myth because our old myths have been used up. People have been trying that for the last 30 years, nobody's buying. It only works is if there's a crisis in the community in which the community threatens to rend themselves apart, like the postmodernists are doing, like it's all difference, it's all about difference. So we start to fragment, and then we find a villain, hero, savior, and align ourselves against Osama bin Laden. And we all come together, and then we've got a new founding myth.
Yeah, Girard's ideas are just fascinating. His idea being that myths are basically the self-serving stories that the privileged invent to justify their own privilege, and that always in the stories of the privileged, in the myths of a society, there has to be a scapegoat, and that when, as you say, when societies come to a crisis, there will inevitably be a scapegoat, and that unites the society, and that will not be satisfied until it demolished.
It's an alternative to what you were saying. I don't know the name of the French intellectual who said what we embrace in the other is the sameness.
Well, and I think that's quite consistent with Girard's ideas, that mimetic desire is also the driving force, because and the source of conflict in society, because we want what the other wants. That's how we find out who we are. We want what the other wants, and that's nice if what we both want is love. But if we both want to be king of the hill, then we're in trouble. And we've particularly created, I think one of the other aspects of the postmodern that's quite ominous, in the collapse of communism and the discrediting of socialism and pretty much most left-wing ideas politically, we've created another monolith in global capitalism, and I wonder if what we're not seeing these very days is what happens to any monolith. It turns on itself. It's got nowhere to go. It starts to it takes advantage, and because it hasn't got anything to come up against. We would see this in Canada for those of you who are Canadians. We've got a political party that rules by divine right, you might say, and there's no opposition. So what's happening before our very eyes is that political party is creating its own opposition. It almost seems that if you create a monolith and just let it go, it won't be long before it turns on itself and creates something brand new. Yes.
You asked about the political party opposition of we see that any tyrant that loses the enemy may create another one with George Bush, the United States. But to ask you, do you know much about the Unitarian faith, about the flower communion in May? You mentioned the Israeli philosopher about Greece was in some flowers, and we put them up on the altar, and then they're consecrated, and after a while, everyone goes up to the altar and takes another one out, and it's a very beautiful, simple. How we're the same, but we're the same, but yet we're very different in our own special way.
Yeah.
Postmodern period is actually ended what we call the proto-modern period, which, as I understood it, I think, was basically it just means it's the beginning.
Well, I've lots of arguments with Lyotard, but one of the things I think he's right about is that postmodern, like it isn't like okay. There's modern and now there's postmodernism, said that the two are cyclical, that every era has its modern period and every era has its postmodern period, and so we often come across figures who are pre-modern before their time, but it's anything that's called post is obviously a time in transition. Yes?
Yeah, just on the whole notion of periodicity and periodization and that kind of thing. Of course, there's input from Vico.
Oh,
who
yeah.
said that each era bears within itself the seeds of its own demise, and so that we're going to come into a post-modern.
Yeah.
Eventually, a fence postmodern, at which time the time is up.
Well, in precisely that sense, and just what I was talking about things eventually inevitably produce their own opposition. Hegel apparently once said, I've never been able to find it, but I think my first year history professor said it, and I just never ever forgot it, said that Hegel said that every historical institution is in the process of becoming its complete opposite. And his example was the Christian Church became the Roman Empire became the Christian Church.
It's those kinds of ahistorical statements that I think have been left out of your analysis of postmodernism and interpretation of it. I was wondering, both I want to say something and then ask you how it is that you didn't present the work of postmodernism, postmodernists, people of the postmodern persuasion, if you will, that curiously are more North American and British than they are French, that are trying to challenge the dichotomy